The afternoon sun bathed the park in a soft golden glow, making everything look warm and peaceful. Children played happily near the fountain, their laughter mixing with the sound of water splashing. Nearby, a street musician played his saxophone, the music flowing through the air and adding to the lively atmosphere of the park. But amid all this energy, there was one man who sat quietly, blending into the scenery. At first, he looked just like any other person in the park, a part of the scene. But if you looked more closely, you'd notice something strange about him. His brown jacket was worn out, with frayed cuffs. His jeans had patches in some places, and his boots looked as though they had been through countless miles. He wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face, hiding his identity. But if you knew who to look for, you'd recognize him immediately: Keanu Reeves. Keanu sat on a weathered wooden bench, a sketchpad resting on his lap. His pencil moved slowly and carefully across the paper as he sketched the reflection of the fountain in the distance. He didn't look up as people walked past, caught up in their busy lives, too distracted to notice who he was. Keanu didn't seem to care about that. He was just enjoying the moment, finding peace in the simplicity of sitting in the park, drawing the world around him. No one could have known that the man drawing the fountain was the Hollywood actor who was known for his kindness, humility, and generosity. And no one could have guessed that he had more of a purpose than just sketching a peaceful scene. At the entrance of the park, a police cruiser slowly rolled to a stop. Two officers stepped out, their black boots crunching on the gravel path as they surveyed the park. Officer Jake, a young and ambitious cop, scanned the area with sharp eyes, his uniform neat and pressed. He walked with purpose, his eyes flicking toward the park bench where Keanu sat. Behind him was Officer Derek, an older, more experienced officer who walked at a slower pace, his movements deliberate and careful. "Over there," Jake said, pointing toward Keanu. "Another vagrant making the park look like a campsite." Derek sighed and adjusted his utility belt. He didn't want to jump to conclusions. "He's just sitting there," he said. "Let's not make assumptions." But Jake was already walking briskly toward the bench. Derek hesitated but followed his partner. Keanu didn't look up as the officers approached. He kept drawing, the pencil moving gently across the paper. "Excuse me, sir," Jake said sharply, his voice carrying in the quiet park. "This is a public park. You can't just loiter here all day." Keanu paused for a moment, then looked up slightly. His expression was calm, his voice polite. "I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just enjoying the day," he said softly. Jake crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow. "Enjoying the day, huh? What's in the bag?" He pointed at the small, worn leather satchel sitting next to Keanu on the bench. Keanu glanced down at the bag and then back at Jake. "Just some pencils and a snack. Nothing illegal, if that's what you're asking," he replied calmly. Derek stepped closer but stayed quiet, observing the situation. He didn't want to escalate things, but he was curious about what was happening. "Mind if we take a look?" Jake asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't a question. He was already sizing up the situation. Keanu exhaled slowly, leaning back a little on the bench. He didn't seem nervous, but he wasn't backing down either. "Do I need to remind you that this is a public space?" he said, his voice steady. "I have every right to sit here." The tension in the air grew, and nearby, a young woman walking her golden retriever slowed down, curious about what was happening. She paused a few feet away, pretending to adjust her dog's leash while keeping an eye on the scene. "Sir," Jake said again, his patience starting to wear thin. "You need to move along. This isn't your personal lounge." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Is sitting on a bench a crime now?" he asked, his voice laced with curiosity but not aggression. Derek finally spoke up. "Look, we're just trying to keep the park safe and welcoming for everyone," he said, his tone softer. "We don't want any trouble." Keanu set his sketchpad down beside him and looked directly at Jake. "Neither do I." The young woman with the dog couldn't stay quiet anymore. "He's not doing anything wrong," she called out, her voice firm but not angry. "It's just a public park. He has as much right to be here as anyone else." Jake turned to look at her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you," he said, his tone dismissive. But the woman stood her ground. "It does. He's not bothering anyone. He has every right to sit here." The crowd around them began to grow as more joggers, dog walkers, and curious onlookers slowed down, watching the scene unfold. Keanu, noticing the growing audience, reached into his bag. For a brief moment, Jake's hand twitched toward his gun, but Keanu simply pulled out a sandwich and unwrapped it, as if he wasn't even paying attention to the officers. Jake's temper flared. "You think this is funny?" he snapped, stepping closer to Keanu, his voice filled with frustration. Keanu took a deliberate bite of his sandwich, chewed slowly, and then looked up at Jake. No, he said evenly. I think it's sad that you feel the need to harass someone for just sitting in a park. The crowd around them murmured, and several people started recording the scene with their phones. Jake's face turned redder with anger. You think you're smarter than us? He said, his voice low and threatening. I'm not letting this go. Keanu brushed crumbs from his lap, his posture relaxed. You seem awfully determined, officer, he said, his tone almost casual. Almost like you have something to prove. Jake's face flushed even more. Watch your tone, he warned, stepping closer. Derek saw that things were getting out of hand. Jake, maybe we should just leave, he suggested, trying to defuse the situation. But Jake wasn't listening. You think you can just sit here, act all smug, and make me look bad? He demanded, his voice shaking with anger. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his expression unchanged. I don't have to make you look bad. You're doing that all by yourself, he replied, his voice steady and calm. Jake took another step toward Keanu, his hand near his belt, ready to make a move. But Derek stepped in front of him, raising a hand to block Jake's path. Back off, Derek said firmly, his voice low but serious. You're making this worse. Before Jake could respond, a voice from the crowd called out, What's he even doing wrong? It was the young woman with the dog again, still holding her phone and recording. You're harassing him for sitting on a bench? Seriously? Jake turned toward her, his anger flaring. This is a police matter, he snapped. Stay out of it. But the crowd wasn't buying it. A man in jogging clothes stepped forward and said, We're all watching, and it doesn't look like he's done anything wrong. Derek saw that the crowd was growing and he could feel the tension rising. Keanu, still sitting on the bench, reached down into his bag again. Jake tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward his gun, but Keanu simply pulled out a small, old device. It looked like a portable radio at first, but when he flipped a switch, a small red light began blinking. Jake's eyes widened. What's that? He demanded, his voice now sharp. Keanu didn't answer. Instead, he turned the device toward the crowd. This, he said, his tone calm, is a live streaming camera. Everything that's happening here is being broadcast in real time. The crowd murmured in surprise. People raised their phones higher, capturing the officer's reactions. Derek froze. You've been recording us the whole time? He asked, his voice now unsure. Keanu nodded, his face expressionless. The world is watching now, he said quietly. Jake's face turned a deep shade of red, and his anger quickly shifted to panic. You can't just record us without permission, he shouted. Keanu raised an eyebrow, his voice still calm. This is a public space just like you told me earlier. You're public servants, right? He asked. Derek rubbed the back of his neck. Jake, he muttered lowly, we need to leave. But Jake wasn't ready to back down. You think this little stunt is going to scare me? He shouted, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. Keanu tilted his head again, his voice steady and clear. It's not about scaring you, he said. It's about holding people accountable. Just then, the sound of sirens interrupted the tension. A black SUV pulled into the park with flashing lights, but the siren was off. The doors opened and a police captain stepped out. She looked around, taking in the scene before speaking. Officers, she said, her voice calm but firm, what's going on here? Derek stepped forward quickly, his hands raised in a calming gesture. Captain Samantha, it's just a misunderstanding, he said, trying to smooth things over. But Captain Samantha cut him off. She turned to Keanu and asked, And you are? Keanu stood up slowly, his tall frame towering over the officers. He adjusted his cap and looked at her directly in the eye. Just a guy sitting on a bench, he said simply. Captain Samantha's eyes flicked to Jake, who was still visibly agitated. Officer Jake, she said coldly, step away. Jake hesitated, but Samantha repeated herself, her voice firm. Step away. Reluctantly, Jake stepped back, his frustration boiling over. Captain Samantha turned to Keanu, her expression softening just a little. Is there a reason this interaction needed to escalate? She asked. Keanu shrugged lightly, his voice quiet but firm. I was wondering the same thing. Samantha glanced at the crowd, their phones pointed at her, and then looked back at the blinking red light on Keanu's camera. Well, she said, now the world is watching thanks to you. Keanu stayed calm. Shouldn't the world be watching? He asked. Don't people have a right to know how they're treated by the people who are supposed to protect them? Samantha thought for a moment before answering. They do, she said, her voice calm. But I also have a responsibility to make sure my officers aren't judged unfairly without all the facts. Keanu leaned forward slightly. It's not about judging anyone, he said. It's about accountability. When someone in power uses it wrong, there's no excuse for ignoring it. Samantha nodded, her eyes thoughtful. I see your point, she said. She glanced at the crowd, then back at Keanu. But now the world is watching. Keanu leaned back, his eyes focused on the officer as she stood up. He looked at her calmly. And that's exactly what needs to happen. As the crowd began to disperse, Captain Samantha sat back on the bench. Keanu took a deep breath, relaxed, and finally put his sketchpad back in his bag. A few people stayed near their phones, still recording. Samantha looked at them quickly before speaking again. Let me make one thing clear, she said, sounding more serious. Officer Jake will be reviewed for what he did today. If he did something wrong, he will be held responsible. Keanu nodded, his face calm. That's all anyone wants. Fairness, he said. Samantha stood up and brushed off her uniform. You made your point, Mr. Reeves, but next time, please bring your concerns to the department first, not make it a public spectacle. Keanu smiled a little, but his voice was serious. Sometimes a public spectacle is the only way to get people to listen. Samantha didn't answer. She just nodded and walked toward the police car where Jake and Derek were standing. When Samantha got closer, Jake stepped out of the car looking very angry. Captain, you're not going to let this guy get away with this, are you? He asked. Enough, Samantha said sharply. Hand over your badge and gun. Jake stopped, his mouth open, not knowing what to say. You can't be serious, he said, stammering. Samantha's voice was cold. You're using your power to hurt someone who did nothing wrong. Jake slowly took off his badge and his gun and gave them to Samantha. He felt so embarrassed as people around him started whispering. Derek looked away, feeling uncomfortable. Samantha turned to Derek. You'll also be part of the review, Officer Derek. This is your warning. You had a chance to stop this, but you didn't? Derek slowly nodded. I understand, Captain. Samantha looked back at Jake. You are on leave until we finish the investigation. You're dismissed. Jake clenched his fists, his hands shaking. This isn't fair, he muttered. What's not fair? Samantha asked. What's not fair is using your power to bully someone who didn't do anything wrong. Jake stormed off and Derek quietly followed. Samantha stood there alone for a moment, then looked back at Keanu, who was drawing in his notebook again. Samantha called out to him, Mr. Reeves? Keanu looked up, his face calm. You've pointed out a real problem, she said, but solving it takes more than just exposing it. I hope you're ready to help fix it. Keanu smiled a little. I always am. Samantha nodded and walked back to the police car. The crowd was getting smaller now and started leaving. Keanu stayed for a little while, still sketching. After some time, he pulled out a small piece of paper from his bag and wrote something on it. He stood up, put the note on the bench, and placed a rock on it to keep it from blowing away. The note said, Justice isn't given, it's earned. Keep watching, keep asking questions. As Keanu walked away, someone from the crowd picked up the note, read it, and smiled. The person took a picture with their phone and then put the note back under the rock. The bench, now empty, seemed to have an important message. Justice starts with awareness. The sun was setting, turning the sky orange and pink. Keanu's live stream, which was recorded, went viral quickly. Many people saw it, shared it, and talked about it online. The hashtags #JusticeOnTheBench and #AccountabilityMatters became popular as people discussed it and asked for changes in how police work. Back in her office, Captain Samantha watched Keanu's video again. She saw the moment when Officer Jake was yelling at Keanu on the bench. Samantha paused the video and thought about it. She knew that this wasn't just about Jake or Derek. It was about rebuilding trust with the public step by step. Meanwhile, at the park, the bench where Keanu sat became a symbol. People came to take pictures and read the note he left behind. A young woman, the same one who helped Keanu earlier, came back with her dog. She stood by the bench for a moment, reading the note again. An older man walked up to her. It's strange, isn't it? He said, pointing at the bench. What is? She asked. How can something as simple as a bench start something so big? He replied. The woman nodded. It's more than just a bench, she said. It's about standing up for what's right when it matters. The man smiled a little. We need more of that, he said. Keanu sat in a quiet diner, drinking his coffee. His phone was buzzing with messages from people, stories of their own experiences, and even interviews from the news. A server came over to him and filled up his cup. She hesitated for a moment, then asked, Excuse me, are you Keanu Reeves? Keanu looked up and smiled. Depends who's asking, he said. The server nervously smiled back. I saw your video. What you did was brave. Keanu nodded. Sometimes bravery is just doing what's right, even when it's not easy. The server paused, then said quietly, "My brother had an encounter with the police a few years ago, and it didn't end well. Seeing what you did gives me hope." Keanu put his cup down and looked at her seriously. "That hope is what can change things. Don't lose it." At the police station, Officer Derek sat in the locker room, his head in his hands. He felt bad because he had seen Jake act wrong, but he didn't stop him. He felt like he made the mistake too. The door opened and Captain Samantha came in. She crossed her arms and looked at Derek. "Derek," she said. He looked up tired. "You've been on the force for a long time. You know when something's wrong." Derek sighed. "I should have stopped him. I knew it was getting out of hand, but I didn't." "You didn't," Samantha interrupted. "And that's the problem." Derek nodded slowly. "I don't have an excuse." Samantha looked at him for a moment before speaking again. "You'll have a chance to make it right. We're starting new de-escalation training and I want you to lead it." Derek's eyes widened in surprise. "You're serious?" he asked. "I am," Samantha said. "You have experience, Derek. Use it to help others learn from your mistakes." The days passed and the park bench became a place for people to talk about justice. People brought flowers and small gifts to leave behind. The news showed how much this incident was making people think about changes that need to happen. Keanu didn't want attention, but he quietly kept working to help make things better. He met with community leaders and listened to the stories of people who reached out to him. One afternoon, a young boy came to the bench with his father. The boy was holding a small bunch of flowers and carefully placed them on the bench. "Why are we leaving flowers, Dad?" the boy asked. His father knelt down and pointed to the note under the rock. "Because this is where someone reminded us that everyone deserves respect. It's a lesson I want you to remember." The boy thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'll remember." The sun was setting over the park, and the bench stood as a quiet reminder of how small actions can make a big difference. Keanu walked down a street, his hands in his pockets, and smiled to himself. He knew that real change often starts with one brave moment of truth. Months passed, but the message Keanu shared stayed with people. The bench became a symbol of hope and change. More people talked about it, and even local leaders started working on reforms to make the police department better. Keanu stayed away from the spotlight, but his message was still powerful. Justice isn't given, it's earned. One evening there was a big event at the park. Many people came to talk about their experiences with injustice. At the center of it all was the bench. Some people had left small plaques with messages of hope on it. The woman with the dog who had been there when Keanu stood up for what was right stood on a small stage with a microphone. She spoke to the crowd. "That day I didn't know who he was," she said, pointing to the bench. "To me, he was just a man standing up for himself and for all of us. He reminded me that we all have a role in making change." The crowd clapped. Officer Derek stood at the back, arms crossed. He had taken his new role of teaching de-escalation seriously and had been working to fix the trust that was broken. As the clapping faded, Derek stepped forward. "I was one of the officers that day," he said. "And I failed. I failed to do the right thing when it mattered most. But I'm here to tell you that I'm learning and I'm listening." The crowd was silent for a moment, then people started clapping. They were showing they believed him. Keanu was sitting in a quiet coffee shop nearby, watching the event on his phone. A barista walked over to him. "I don't mean to bother you, but is that the event from the park?" she asked. Keanu nodded, showing her the screen. "It's amazing how much has come from that one moment," she said. "You started something really special." Keanu smiled a little. Sometimes small actions can start something big. Keanu put the phone down and looked at her. "I didn't start anything," he said. "I just gave people a reason to believe in their own power." The next day, the bench was on the evening news. A reporter stood beside it and talked about how important it was and how it had inspired people. Behind her, a family sat together, reading the notes and plaques that visitors had left. The reporter ended by saying, "It's a reminder that even small acts of courage can start something big." On this bench, a quiet man made a loud statement, and the world is still listening. At the police station, Captain Samantha was looking at reports about new programs to help the community. She noticed the time and stood up to go to her next meeting. Her phone buzzed, and when she looked at it, she saw an article called "From a Bench to a Movement: How One Day Changed the City." The photo showed the bench covered with flowers, plaques, and notes from people. Samantha smiled to herself and put her phone in her pocket. She knew there was still a lot to do, but she also knew that change had to start somewhere. That evening, as the park became quiet, a lone figure walked toward the bench. It was Keanu Reeves, wearing simple clothes. He sat down and took a deep breath. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the lights of the city twinkled far away. Keanu pulled out a notebook and started to write something. He tore out the page and left it on the bench. The note said, "The fight for justice is never over, but every step forward matters. Keep going." As Keanu stood up and walked away, a breeze made the note flutter slightly before it settled back on the bench. The bench stayed there, a quiet but powerful reminder of what could happen when one person chooses to stand up, speak out, and believe in the chance to make things better. Months passed, and the story of the bench kept spreading. What used to be just a place to rest became a symbol of hope and fairness. It was called the Bench of Justice. People came from different cities to see it and leave their own notes about injustice and strength. A small sign by the city council read, "Dedicated to those who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." One day, a group of middle school students came on a field trip. They gathered around the bench while their teacher explained its meaning. "This bench represents a big change in our city," she said. "It's where one person showed us that even small actions can make a big difference." One boy asked, "What did he do?" The teacher smiled and answered, "He stayed calm and stood his ground. He didn't shout or fight, but he made people think. And that was enough to make everything change." The boy thought for a moment, then sat on the bench. He took out his notebook and wrote something on it before slipping the note under a rock nearby. Keanu kept working quietly behind the scenes. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. Instead, he met with people who worked for change and supported them. One day, he was invited to speak at a small meeting. He told the group, "I'm not here to tell you how to change the world. I'm here to remind you that the world can change because of you. The most important thing is to keep asking questions, challenge what feels wrong, and don't underestimate the power of small actions. Sometimes just sitting on a bench is enough to start a conversation." The people in the room cheered, feeling inspired. Back at the park, Captain Samantha walked to the bench, holding a single white lily. She hadn't been there since the incident, but something made her come back. She sat down and placed the flower on the bench, staring at the fountain for a while. The park was peaceful, and she thought about the changes in her department. New programs to keep officers safe and help the community had made a difference. But Samantha knew there was still work to do. Mistrust still existed and progress was slow. But as she sat there, she felt hope. As the sun set, Keanu approached the bench. He asked if he could sit, and Samantha nodded, making room for him. They both sat in silence for a while, watching the fountain. Keanu finally spoke, "You've done a lot since that day." Samantha smiled, "So have you." Keanu agreed, "It's a start." Samantha then asked, "Do you think we've done enough?" Keanu looked at the fountain and said, "Change doesn't happen all at once, but every step matters. Every choice matters. And the fact that you're asking means you're on the right path." As the night fell and the park emptied, Keanu stood up, threw his satchel over his shoulder, and walked away. Before he left, he turned to Samantha and said, "Keep going. The world needs more people like you." Samantha watched him leave, her thoughts filled with determination. She looked down at a note still hidden under the rock on the bench. She read it again. "The fight for justice is never over, but every step forward matters. Keep going." She took a deep breath and stood up, ready to keep going. A year and a half after that day, the bench had become more than just a symbol. It was part of a movement. People posted pictures with #justice on the bench, sharing their stories of standing up for what was right. Artists painted murals in the park, and one of them showed a man sitting on the bench with the words, "Justice begins when someone dares to sit still." The movement spread far beyond the park, with schools and groups talking about how small actions can lead to big changes. Keanu Reeves stayed in the background, quietly supporting programs to help law enforcement and communities talk to each other. He didn't want to be in the spotlight. Instead, he let other voices take center stage. One day he said to a group of activists, "Change doesn't have a face. It has many. It's not about me. It's about all of us finding the courage to confront what's wrong and the patience to build something better." At the original bench, people still came to sit, reflect, and leave notes. Some wrote about their struggles with injustice, while others thanked the man who had turned a quiet moment into a powerful one. One evening, a teenage girl sat on the bench, holding a notebook. She had come alone after reading about the bench. Slowly, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Sometimes I feel invisible, like no one hears me. But sitting here, I realize that even quiet voices matter. I promise I'll speak up, even when it's hard." She folded the note and placed it under the same rock where Keanu had left his first message. Officer Derek, who had been part of the story, was now a leader in the police department. He worked hard to help younger officers and rebuild trust in the community. One day he spoke at a meeting and said, "I was there that day and I didn't do enough. But it taught me something. It's never too late to do better. The crowd applauded, recognizing his dedication to change. Captain Samantha, now the chief of police, used the story of the bench to inspire her department. She created programs to improve transparency and accountability, including an annual day of service where officers worked alongside the community. At a press conference, she said, "This isn't about one incident or one person. It's about creating a culture where accountability is normal, not rare. We've come a long way, but we know the work is far from done." One quiet morning, Keanu returned to the park. He was dressed simply in a black jacket and jeans. The park was calm, with only a few joggers and a man walking his dog. Keanu walked to the bench, now covered in plaques and flowers. He smiled gently and ran his fingers over one of the plaques. It said, "Justice isn't given. It's earned." Keanu sat down, pulled out his notebook, and stared at a blank page for a while. He listened to the birds and the sound of the water from the fountain. Finally, he began to write, "To the person reading this, you are not powerless. You are not invisible. The world changes when you decide to act. Never underestimate your impact." He folded the note carefully and placed it under the same rock where his first note had been. He stood up, adjusted his satchel, and looked at the bench one last time before walking away. Years later, the bench was still a symbol of quiet resistance and change. People kept visiting, leaving messages of hope and courage. The movement Keanu started had grown into a global call for justice. Even though he stayed out of the public eye, his legacy lived on. It wasn't because of his fame, but because of the message he left behind. Justice begins when one person dares to sit still and speak the truth. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe for more stories. I'll see you in the next video.